When Roman told me what the theme was for this year's conference, Imagination Implemented, I had to check what it was, Imagination Implemented, I immediately knew what I wanted to speak about. And that is failure. Because the biggest impediment that I have seen to implementation is failure, the fear of failure. And I started to write this speech a while ago. The minute I proposed it, my partner Erica here, the two of us started brainstorming all the possible things we could say, and the list went on and on and on. And I didn't realize how much I had to say about failure. And then I wanted to start with a definition of failure, and I thought, I don't know if that's necessary. So in order to determine whether I need a definition of failure, I'm going to do a little experiment. Could I invite all of you to please stand up? Okay. So my question to you is, if within the last month or so, you have had an experience where you thought you had failed, but actually turned out to be a good thing that you had, all right? Could you please sit down? Wow. Congratulations, you had a really positive experience with failure. Okay. If you have, within the last 1 month, failed at something and got away with it, no one found out, could you please sit down? All right. Congratulations, you got away with it. Right. And the last question I have is, within the last month or so, have you had a spectacular failure and everybody's known about it? Could you please take a seat? A spectacular failure and everyone knew about it. All right, congratulations, you failed big. Okay, I'm going to make the assumption that everybody else who's left standing has not failed in the last 1 month, and congratulations on surviving that. So pat yourselves on the back and then sit down and think about why you might want to change that. Sorry? Oh, so you had a small failure. Okay. And somebody noticed. All right. How did it make you feel? Irrelevant. Still processing. All right. You're right. That would have been one more question to add. Thank you. I'll take that as a point forward for next time. All right, so I imagine that everybody in the room has had some experience with failure, and so I don't really need to define what that is. What I have come to understand is that failure is actually part of a two-part story. It's one side of a two-sided coin. The coin is risk. And on one side of the coin, we have the element of success. And on the other side of that coin, we have the possibility of failure. But just as any currency, you need both parts to make it work. So if we want to embrace the possibility of success, we also have to learn to embrace the possibility of failure. Okay? And there are many ways in which we can do that. But in order to be able to learn how to embrace and tolerate the possibility of failure and how to live with it, we have to first understand what failure is. What is the risk of failure all about? And where does it come from? So those of you who live in Pakistan, and this excludes most of my colleagues here, except for one who is from Mexico City, so she knows exactly what I'm talking about. Karachi can often feel like a battlefield, right? If there is one thing that as Pakistanis we know, that is risk. Every single day when we leave our homes, we're dealing with risk. And perhaps this might be a moot point to discuss here, but in the armed forces, they have a model for assessing risk. And I thought that model was really critical for understanding in this situation, because often Pakistan can feel like a battlefield. So the 4 elements of risk. that the armed forces, the military, prepares its soldiers to face. And those four elements are volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Okay, those are the four elements of risk. So what is volatility? It's a lot of rapid change. It's change you can't keep up with. It's unexpected, it happens very quickly, you can't necessarily anticipate where it's going next. That's what volatility looks like and feels like. A mess. Okay? However, how do we overcome the risk of volatility? So the way to overcome the risk of volatility is basically to have a strong vision. So if you are, as an individual or as an organization, if you have a strong, compelling, clear vision, a clear goal, all you need to do to survive volatility is to keep your eye on the goal. It's kind of like playing on a football field. For those of you who can't understand my graphics, let me explain. That is supposed to be a football field. And the ball moving on a football field really reminded me of volatility. But eventually, the goal is to get it through those goalposts. Okay, so the second piece of the risk puzzle is uncertainty, where we can't predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen next. So what do you do in those situations? Okay. Well, the answer to that is understanding. We seek to gain understanding so that we can have a better understanding of what's going to happen next. We do things like future casting. We look at trend analysis. Okay. We look at what's happening in other industries around us. We look at the history of what's already happened. So we stop, we look, we listen. Right? And we gather a lot of data in order to predict what's going to happen next a little bit better. To mitigate that risk, we have to gather data. Complexity. Again, this is a situation that I think in Pakistan we're quite aware of. We don't always know how things are connected. Right? We don't always know how one thing is going to influence another. We end up in situations where our actions can have many repercussions that we can't anticipate simply because we don't know how many people are being influenced by our decisions. So in order to overcome the dangers of complexity, what we need is clarity. Okay? And clarity comes from really studying the facts. Considering how things make us feel. What is our gut feeling about things? What are our hunches? What does our intuition tell us? Because actually our brain is a really powerful tool, and the problem is that we don't necessarily have the skills to harness everything that our brain is telling us. And hunches are basically information that hasn't come to the surface yet. But it's information you can trust. Okay? Intuition is something you can trust. And what I found in my research is that when we're dealing with complexity, on the surface it's difficult for us to analyze, but if we dig deep into our intuition, we can often gain far more insight than you would just by analyzing facts only. Am I flickering? Are the lights flickering? They're possessed. Lights are possessed. Can somebody stop the lights from flickering? All right, thank you. All right, ambiguity. Can anyone tell me what that picture is supposed to be? Ah, see, all the Pakistanis have the answer. Because we deal with ambiguity all the time. It's when we have only part of the information. We don't have all of the information. So for those of us who have arrived here day before yesterday in anticipation of KLIC, we were dealing with an enormous amount of ambiguity. We didn't even know until this morning how many conference attendees we were going to have. We didn't know how many people to plan for in our workshops, right? We didn't quite know if Beach Luxury Hotel would be standing today, all right? Because in Karachi, anything can happen, unfortunately. We didn't have all the information. So being people from the creativity community, we tolerated ambiguity, and we adapted. And we displayed a skill called agility. And agility means that you are able to respond in the moment. For those of you who have ever worked with Faris over there, our friend Faris, would you please stand up? He's an improv specialist. And improv is about being present in the moment and just going with the flow and responding to whatever life throws at you. Whatever line is thrown at you, you take it and you run with it, right? It's the yes and approach. And that's kind of what we have to do with ambiguity. Whatever comes our way, we have to be ready to respond. I'm a martial artist. I know I don't look like it, but one of the things that we have to do as a martial artist is learn to spar, is learn to fight. And you never know what attack is coming at you. So you're always on the balls of your feet, right? You're always on the balls of your feet because it allows you to move quickly, adapt quickly, get out of the way, throw a kick. That's kind of the situation that you would find yourself in, and that's the skill you need to develop mentally, emotionally, and professionally. Okay, so how do you do this successfully? How do you start to learn to be, to have a strong vision? How do you learn to be understanding, to have some clarity, and to be agile more than anything else, right? In order to do all of that, you have to be able to first accept that failure is an option, and it's a real option, right? How do you stop yourself from emotionally shutting down at the possibility of failure? So the way to do that is you develop a mindset for taking risks, okay? How do you feel when you fail? Anybody, throw me a bone here. How do you feel when you fail? Lousy, discouraged. Anything else? Ashamed. Challenged, sorry? Thinking. Depressed, yeah, stressed, okay. Figuring out a new way of not doing something. So that's actually a positive response because you've got, great, so that's exactly where we want to go. There is a gift that you can give yourselves today, okay? Oh, there is a gift you can give yourself today. From today onwards, give yourselves permission to make 30 mistakes a day. All right? It will be the most liberating thing you will ever do to yourself. It really will. You just say, that's okay, it's part of my mistake quotient. Right? I am going to give myself permission to fail 30 times. And it doesn't have to be massive failures, it can be small failures. It can be the fact that I forgot my laptop charger at home and now I desperately need it, right? It doesn't have to be anything big. But if you give yourself permission, then you stop losing a lot of emotional energy in that, oh my God, I failed again situation. Yes? They have a much greater mistake quotient than 30. They have 30 mistakes an hour. We've already done this talk there. Okay. The other thing, the other way that you can start to embrace risk-taking, okay, that you can get comfortable with the idea of taking a risk, and this is something that I actually use with my children a great deal because I want them to be willing to take some chances in their lives, is imagine, okay? And you're asking yourself the question, what might be the worst thing that could happen? Right? You're going to make a decision, you're going to take an action, and you're really afraid that you might fail. So what we do is a worst case scenario assessment. And then we ask ourselves, can we tolerate that? Can we handle that? Can we survive that? Because if we can survive that, then it's not a big deal. Right? We can handle it. Anyone here who's been held up at gunpoint, and I'm sure numerous people have, yes. It's this is, you know you can survive it, alhamdulillah, right? So it's not the worst thing that could happen anymore. And it's a risk you take every single day when you step out of your home. But then there's the additional risk, the risk of not taking action. What do you stand to lose if you do nothing in a situation? That has to be part of your decision-making process about whether or not you're going to take a risk, right? So that's a really important question to ask yourself. And then the pièce de résistance is what might be the best thing that could happen, right? So that you're balancing the risk of failure with the possibility of success. And if the possibility of success, and if success is such a big gain, can you really afford not to go after it? Right? Okay. Embracing failure. How can we embrace something that looks like that thing on the left? Oh, and I can't get this to work. Oh, there it is. Right? I think of failure sometimes as a piece of coal. It's a diamond in the rough, right? What does it take to convert that to this? Patience. Yeah. Actually, I'm going to come back to something you said, and that was that you look at failure as an opportunity to learn, right? Learn what not to do. It's a famous story that Thomas Edison actually had over 9,000 different attempts at making a light bulb before he succeeded. Okay? And when somebody said to him, how did you keep going when you failed that many times? He said, but I didn't fail. I kept learning. I learned 9,000 ways how not to do it. Right? And if that's the mindset that we can adopt, then we're really starting to develop a learning relationship with failure. So how do you learn from failure? There's actually a really easy, simple 3-step process that you can use to learn from failure. And that process is, you start by asking yourself the question, what? What happened? Okay? What was the situation? Who was involved? What was the sequence of events that brought me to a point, to an outcome where I failed? All right? And then that's followed by the question, so what? You know, what were the consequences? What happened because of what I did? This works wonderfully with children and spouses also. So for those of you who are trying to give feedback to your children about something they did, ask them what happened, and then ask them to think about the consequences of what happened. And the most powerful piece of it is the now what. Okay? What are you going to do differently next time? What will you do more of? What will you do less of? How will you set yourself up for success the next time? Okay? And that's a really, really critical way in which you can learn from failure. But there's one additional gift here. You can actually use this learning cycle when you succeed as well. Because there's nothing that says we can't learn from success just as much as we can learn from failure. And if you're going to use this with your spouses or your employees or your children, I really suggest that the next time they do something well, you use the learning cycle to debrief what happened so that they have a positive association with learning and using this cycle. And then when you use it to give them some feedback on when something didn't go so well, they don't see it as criticism, they see it as learning and growth. Okay? And then speaking of learning and growth, failure and growth has a really, really close relationship. So I call myself a parentologist. I study children and behavior and families a great deal. And one of the things I've observed is that from the age of 0 to 5, we have a very high tolerance for failure. If we didn't, we would never learn to walk because we would always be afraid of falling. All right? We would never learn to stand, we would never learn to walk. We wouldn't learn to talk because we would be afraid of sounding foolish. Okay? So as children, we have a very high tolerance for failure. At age 5, they go to school and we start to penalize them for failing, for making mistakes. So what happens is that tolerance for failure drops dramatically. You'll notice that it continues to drop except for the little bumps. And that little bump, the first bump you see is teenage rebellion. The second bump you see is when you graduate from college and you suddenly have this verve and vim and vigor to go out and do something with your life, and you decide to take a risk. And then the world beats you down and you get back to zero tolerance for failure, right? However, what happens is if you were to plot our ability to learn right along with our ability to tolerate failure, you will see that the ability to learn drops dramatically every time our tolerance for failure drops. And over time, our learning just hits a plateau. We stop learning. We stop growing because we're so afraid of making a mistake. So my challenge to you is, how might you change this curve? All right? So going forward over the next 2 days, today and tomorrow, please keep this in mind. And also keep this in mind, that you never fail until you stop trying. All right? Thank you very much.